Thank you. My name is Dr. Joan Reed. I'm Dean for Diversity and Community Partnership at Harvard Medical School and a professor of medicine. And I'm so pleased that today we have joining with us for a discussion Dr. Bettye Kearse, the author of The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, and filmmaker Eduardo Montes-Bradley, whose documentary, The Other Madisons, The Bettye Kearse Story, we will watch together today. For Dr. Kearse, for more than 30 years, she has served as a pediatrician at Kearney Hospital and the Neponset Health Center in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood. She retired in 2014 and now lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Dr. Kearse is a descendant of the enslaved cook Corrine and Corrine's enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. In March 2020, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt published the hardcover edition of her memoir, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. The paperback edition was released today. In this deeply personal account, Dr. Kearse reveals the obstacles, internal and external, she confronted while becoming her family's oral historian, one determined to tell the whole story. The Other Madisons has garnered strong reader and editorial reviews. It's earned an International Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society Book Award for nonfiction and an Outstanding Book Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. The Other Madisons was listed by Smithsonian Magazine as one of the top best history books of 2020 and by Kirkus as one of the best nonfiction books of 2020. And also joining us today is Eduardo Montes-Bradley. He's a writer, filmmaker with over 50 titles to his credit. His filmography embraces remarkable men and women in the arts and sciences, and most of his films are now available at public and academic libraries in the United States, Europe, Australia, and Canada. He has been awarded multiple distinctions for his films, as well as for his portraiture of the descendants of the enslaved community at James Madison's Montpelier in Virginia. His biographical portrayals of Poet Laureate of the United States, Rita Dove, and civil rights activist Julian Bond were presented at the Royal Academy of London. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Bettye Kearse.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. I am an American Griot, which is spelled Griotte, which means I am a female Griot, which is spelled Griot. Griots and griots are oral historians in the ancient African tradition. For thousands of years, these women and men who have amazing memories have spoken the stories of their people and the histories of their ancestors. This tradition remains alive in Africa, and having survived nearly 2 centuries of voyages to America through the Middle Passage, roughly from 1619 to 1808, it remains alive in many African American homes today. Without this enduring practice, I would not know that I am a descendant of the enslaved cook Corrine and her enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. When I think back to the time I first heard about the president and his slave, I see myself as a 5-year-old getting more and more fidgety while my mother made fancy dresses for me. That's when she would give me that look, throw up her hands and say, "Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president." This is my family's credo, the statement that has guided us for more than 200 years. And by repeating it on such occasions, my mother was telling me how proud she was of our ancestry, both white and Black. And she was letting me know how she was expected me to behave. And the reasons supported by the family stories she had told me again and again. The Credo began 6 generations before I was born. Dolly Madison had just sold her husband's and Corinne's teenage son, my great, great, great grandfather, Jim. As Jim was being taken away, Corinne pleaded with him, always remember, you're a Madison. She believed the name could help them find each other someday, but they never saw each other again. Yet Jim remembered his mother's words and passed them on to his children and told them to tell their children that they're a Madisons. Over the generations, as America changed, words were added, and the Credo reminded us that we're not just descendants of a president, we're descendants of enslaved people too. In 1990, my mother, my family's 7th generation Griot, turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, thereby making me the 8th generation Griot. When I asked her why now, she answered in her slight Texan drawl, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. I was a pediatrician, but my mother knew I loved to write. Her intent was for me to write down the stories in order to preserve them. She recognized that as what our ancestors had endured during slavery and what her grandfather, her father, and she herself had endured during Jim Crow became a part of the distant past, our family would become comfortable with our lives and forget our history. Also, she felt that now was the time for our family's story to become part of America's story. But I wasn't comfortable with this assignment. I knew I could write a book about our history, but I thought I cannot be the one to hold up the torch of family pride. For many years, I had wondered why, or even whether, the Credo should make me proud. For me, it resounded with the abuses of slavery. I decided that to become a Griot who understands and had reconciled all that the Credo is saying, and a writer who tells the whole story, I would confront the discomforting parts of that story. So in 1992, I began my journey of discovery of my ancestors, our country, and myself. I traveled to Lagos, Portugal, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where the first of my family's first African ancestor was born, and she was also our first Griot. I also traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, where a replica of a slave ship sits in a museum, to Central Texas, where my great-great-grandparents and their 8 sons learned they were free, and to New York City, where an 18th century African burial ground had recently been discovered. But I went many, many times to Montpelier, James Madison's former plantation in Virginia, where 3 generations of my family had been enslaved. My travels taught me that wherever African slaves once walked, history buried their footsteps. At the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, as slave ships sailed along, under a gaudy concession stand in Portugal, under a federal building near Wall Street, among the ashes of burned documents and personal papers in courthouses and in private homes, and beneath a brick walkway and in unmarked graves at Montpelier. I also learned that enslaved people were remarkable individuals who possessed inner strength and a sense of hope by which they survived, and many talents by which they contributed tremendously to America. And when slaves died, they did not take these qualities to the grave with them. They passed them on to their descendants, including me. My ancestors and those of other African Americans, I came to realize, are best remembered not in carefully recorded names, dates, and places, not in the letters, documents, and photographs kept in old cardboard boxes, and not even in the family stories told from generation to generations. Our ancestors are best remembered in everything we do with what we inherited from the men and women who came before us. We are the evidence of what happened to the stolen Africans who had survived. The list of who we are and how we represent these astounding people is long, and the possibilities are infinite because we all have talents and strengths passed down to us from our ancestors held in bondage. I have a president on my family tree, but we all have family stories that inspire. I believe that through the book I have written, I found a way to make the world pay attention to the enslaved people who helped build this country. And I hope that how I try to live my life will help keep memory of them alive. My book, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, was published in March 2020. And as Dr. Reed mentioned, the paperback edition came out today. During the decades since receiving the box from my mother, I became a griot who will not let her footsteps be buried. And I discovered that it is the words, "You come from African slaves," in my family's credo that make me proud. I met filmmaker Eduardo Montes-Bradley at Montpelier. And when he read my book, he sent me an email asking if I want to make a movie. As a California girl, I love the idea of being a movie star. So, of course, I said yes. And here is my film director, who helped me through his vast experience, make my film debut. Eduardo?
I don't have to say that I'm honored that she took upon offer my email to become sort of a vessel to carry her story further from a book and into a film. The film, as you will see, touches many of the aspects um, that Betty just mentioned about her quest, her saga, and it also frames it with the help of Christian cults and other historians to contextualize it. I think that a filmmaker speaks better for his films than he does in person like this. So I encourage you all to pay attention to the film, and I'll be at the end joining Dr. Reed and Dr. Kearse to answer your questions about the film, the experience, and the story. So thank you, Dr. Reed. Thank you, Dr. Kearse, and please enjoy the movie.
The first horn lifts its arm over the dew-lit grass, and in the slave quarters there is a rustling. Children are bundled into aprons, cornbread and water gourds grabbed, a salt pork breakfast taken. I watch them driven into the vague before dawn while their mistress sleeps like an ivory toothpick and Massa dreams of asses, rum, and slave funk. I cannot fall asleep again. At the second horn, the whip curls across the backs of the laggards, sometimes my sister's voice, unmistaken, among them. "Oh, pray," she cries, "oh, pray." Those days I lie on my cot, shivering in the early heat, and as the fields unfold to whiteness and they spill like bees among the fat flowers, I weep. It is not yet daylight.
Well, there's quite a story about my family, where they came from. And actually, we did not start out in Oakland. And my family started out in Ghana, West Africa, if we want to go back to the first of our ancestors in this country. And her name was Mandy. And Mandy was a young woman when she was captured from the shore near her village when she was alone. And so an amazing part of our family story, and probably many other African American family story, is that they survived the Middle Passage. And then they had to survive the breaking in period, not just physically, but also emotionally, as they had to adapt to becoming an enslaved person where they had been free in Africa. Often when I would get fidgety, especially while she was trying to get me to stand still as she made fancy dresses for my piano recitals, my mother would bring out the box of family memorabilia and pull out items and tell me stories. Even before she started telling the stories, she would admonish me with our family credo, which has guided us for some 200 years. She would say, "Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president." By repeating the credo at such times, she was telling me how proud she was of our ancestors, both white and black. But she was also letting me know how she was expecting me to behave. And the reasons were supported by those family stories that she was getting ready to tell me.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you for your story. Thank you for sharing with all of us. I feel like a part of my family story was told today also. This was passed on from generation to generation. And you talked about your mother sharing this box with you and telling you to write the story, but it took you about 30 years to write The Other Madisons. Why? Why did it take 30 years?
It took that long for many reasons. One is that I wasn't quite sure how best to present this very rich material that I received from my mother. So I tried writing it as a straightforward family story. I tried writing it as a work of fiction. And then settled on memoir as the best way. Because then I could become part of the story. I could become the vehicle for the story and interpret it as well, sort of giving it my own take in a way that I thought would be relevant today and would, resonate with the young people today. Another reason it took so long is that the research was difficult. I did a lot of traveling, and in this country, I ran into multiple roadblocks in trying to find some of the information that I wanted. And then another reason is that I had to grow as a person. It's a very complex story that requires a lot of self-reflection to really portray in a way that's both personable and recognizable to other people in themselves. As you said, that you could see your own, your own story and probably your own self in it as well. So it was just a lot of reasons. It just took a long time. Plus I was working full time. I was a pediatrician during much of that writing.
So I have to divulge in all truth. So I knew that Dr. Kearse was a pediatrician. Dr. Kearse was my daughter's first pediatrician. And for me, it was such a joy to have this Black woman, MD, PhD, kind and gentle, be the first physician to lay her hands on Loretta. So touched our family in lots of ways, Betty. What do you want most readers, what do you hope they'll take away from the story? What is it that you want them to learn, remember?
Yes, I mean, I mention it over and over again, every opportunity I have. So I mentioned it in my presentation, and it's also in the film. And that is that enslaved people were just amazing human beings, and they had the qualities I mentioned, the strength and the talents, and that those talents did not die with them and were passed on to the generations today. And I would really hope that all African Americans, but especially our young people, would embrace their slave ancestry and grab onto and nurture their own inner strengths, their own sense of hope, and their own talents, so they can believe in themselves and make contributions to our country just as their enslaved ancestors had done.
Thank you, Betty. I want to say to those who are here, the question and answer is open. So if you want to submit any questions for Dr. Kearse or for Eduardo, please do so. You gave Mandy a voice, and you spoke as a memoir and you gave her a voice. How did it feel to write as Mandy?
Oh, it felt wonderful. It was a very intimate experience. As I did my research, especially in the travels that I did, like to, well, let's say especially to Ghana, of all the travels, that was the one that brought me closest to her because I could begin to see myself in her that, you know, I could have been in that situation in the slave castle. But throughout the research, I just became, and the writing, I just became very close to her to the point where I did not hear her voice, but I knew that she was speaking to me. I knew what she wanted me to write and to share. And so it just felt, you know, it was very close to an enslaved ancestor and felt that I was growing as a person as I identified with her. So those are my favorite parts of the book is, you know, where she spoke because it just felt so right.
So along with that, though, part of this also spoke of violence and brutality in our history. And how did it feel to work through that, to write about that, this part of our history and of your family?
You know, it was difficult, but it was very rewarding because I learned that enslaved people, particularly the women, were, you know, very strong and resilient. I mean, just imagine having your own child taken away from you and sold, and you know you're never going to see them again. What kind of strength, you know, what kind of strength does that take? You know, but again and again, our enslaved ancestors did that.
You talked about you as part of this 8th generation. You talk about your daughter and your grandchildren. Who are you going to pass this torch on to? How will it continue in your family?
Well, the way it works, just to back up just a little bit, is that in each generation, someone is chosen to be responsible for the box, you know, with the archives and responsible for the stories. And I had a brother, but I'm older, and I was the one who had to stand by the sewing machine while my mother made the fancy dresses and hear the stories to keep me quiet. But anyway, in my generation, I was chosen. In my mother's generation, she was chosen. And she had 2 brothers, but for a number of reasons she was chosen. She was probably the closest to her dad. Now, in my case, I only have 1 child. So she doesn't really have a choice. She will be able to choose one of her 2 children to carry it on. So it's important for our family in each generation to make sure there is someone who is chosen to be responsible.
I want to turn to Eduardo, but before then, we have a question that came in. It says, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm a history educator working with the Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier, and I teach law enforcement officers in Virginia about the history of slavery and civil rights in America. Given your family's history, what is the most significant takeaway that you want others to know and to teach to others?
In terms of the Constitution?
I don't know if it's the Constitution or the history or your family, but how does this relate to today? And what needs to be taught today?
Well, you know, perhaps this is a good time to turn to Eduardo because the film takes my book a few steps forward into today in talking about how slavery influence what African Americans are dealing with today and how we continue to struggle to have the rights that the Constitution supposedly gave us.
Eduardo?
Yes. What would be the question then? What is the context with today's reality? I think that I've done several films on African American history here in the United States, and I think that they are all vignettes of particular episodes in a much larger saga of events. And that they all should someone be in a permanent state of revision. We should continue to visit these particular stories in order to understand exactly or approximately what is the situation in which that we are witnessing today. To me, a very powerful scene in the film is the Black woman at the end marching on Black Lives Matter in Washington, D.C. She's a strong woman and she's young. And she's also a veteran of the armed forces with a past in Afghanistan. So again, here it is, a Black woman who had contributed somewhat in a personal scale in building this nation. It's a nation builder. And she's very angry at what was happening. And she points the finger to my camera and she says, "You don't get it." And I think that is important. Yes, we don't get it. And the book and the further contextualization that the film does of certain aspects of the book is one of the ways in which we can start getting it.
Thank you. As you think about this, and Bettye is gone, Dr. Kearse has gone from this oral history to written. And can you talk a little bit about that transition? What does oral history provide that written doesn't? And then I want Eduardo to follow up with, you have this written history that you've moved to this visual and this audio and this film. And sort of talk about this transition from the oral to the book to the film. So I'll start with you, Bettye.
Oral history really tells you who your ancestors were. You know, what kind of qualities they had and how they influence who you are today. Yeah, written records are great in terms of documenting maybe where someone was and maybe what they did. But if you want to know the kind of people that your ancestors were, it's through the oral tradition.
So more of the spirit and who they were and how they lived, et cetera. As
Yes.
A name and a date and a job. So you've taken it to the book in this space. Or Eduardo, can you move further in terms of this thinking of moving it from the book to this documentary film?
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry.
no, that's my question.
I believe also that oral history is fundamental, but it's also, we shouldn't forget that it's a social construction. We build a legacy based on our perception of the facts, which in many instances are not there for us. And it's very inconvenient for the historian, for the writer, for the filmmaker, for the Griot even, to carry on. In this particular case, we had almost no existing graphic evidence. So we had to reconstruct the story based on masterpieces of artwork. Needless to say, the portrait of Jim, who was sold to the South is not a portrait of the real Jim, which we don't know what he looked like. But after discussing thoroughly with Bettye, we came to the conclusion that yes, that is our Jim, although it is a masterpiece of the 18th century. The same thing happens with this score, with the music. We're trying to recreate a situation that has been systematically erased from American history. And I think that in this case, we did a very good job. Yeah, Bettye and I.
What is lost and what is gained in that process?
The question is for me?
Yes.
I think everything is gained. I don't think that we lost anything. On the contrary, we worked, Bettye and I, in replicating an experience that I have performed in the past as anthropologist and archaeologist on film. And the pieces you don't find, we replace them or substitute them by proven alike evidence. So nothing is just pulled out of my hat. Everything has a correspondence that has been thoroughly tested by academics throughout fields. So what are the chances that Jim looked like the painting that we used? Many. Most likely he just looked like that, and he was in that same position, handcuffed and with the same look of concern for the future. So we don't lose anything. What we did basically is reconstruct the story. It's a little bit, well, what happens when you find all these broken bones of a dinosaur in Patagonia, and then you have to recreate the skeleton to show it at the National Museum that's what happens because we don't have much more to go on with. We don't know what was in the mind of these people either. I'm referring to all the protagonists and antagonists of the story.
I wanted to add a little bit to that. The stories and the research that I did for the book and writing the book brought the characters alive for me. But I think that the film brings the characters alive for the many viewers who will see it.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Because the first person that gets the torch, that gets the hint, that knows is the explorer. And in this case, that's exactly what Bettye did. She came firsthand with this information through her mother, the oral tradition, the famous box, and then her travels and expeditions and readings. And then when I come in, when the filmmaker comes in, he comes in as a translator. How do I translate this vision, these feelings, this information into something that, using common denominator values, would be understood not only by present generation, but by future generations as well?
Absolutely. No, there's a quote in chapter 11, the term visiting. And if you shake a family tree, a chain will rattle. What does that mean? Bettye?
Yes, that means that the slave masters went from cabin to cabin to, I would make use of, what did I say in the film? Pay attention to rape different women, that they owned. And in my family, before I came along and tried to be more direct, sort of calling it what it is. And it's still uncomfortable for me to use the word rape, but it was never used in previous generations. It was painful and shameful. So when the master went from cabin to cabin, it was called visiting. And there's another term that's used or was used, throughout the South, was the word trespassing. And that meant that someone other than the master had gone from cabin to cabin and was trespassing on the master's property, the women that the masters owned.
It's sort of relating part of this in this past to today, and I think about the Me Too movement and all of these other things that we're talking about today, and the voice of women rising about visiting and about these other kinds of things in today's terms. Can you relate some of this story, Bettye, to where we are today, be it in women and Me Too, be it the meaning of George Floyd and what's happened there? What does it mean for Blacks today? What does it mean for women today?
Well, for Black women, and actually Eduardo and I were just discussing this last week. Last week, I believe, was the anniversary of Breonna Taylor's murder. And Eduardo and I were talking about how things have not changed as much as we think they have, that Black women are still devalued, all too often. And in terms of George Floyd, the Constitution in many ways laid the groundwork for that murder by calling enslaved people 3/5 of human beings, or designating them as 3/5 of a population instead of whole people, and by using the term other persons. So other persons marginalized Black people, and the 3/5 clause minimalized, their humanity. And then there are clauses in the Constitution that kind of gave Derek Chauvin, is that his name right? The police officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. The Constitution allowed Congress to set up a militia to suppress any kind of slave insurrection, anything that made slaves look like they were dangerous, or made Black people look like they were dangerous. Congress could set up a militia and deal with them. And the Constitution also allows states to have their own militia. And then the third part of the Constitution that put George Floyd's life in danger, maybe not so much his life, but negated his rights, is that the Constitution denied the rights of legal process to anyone who had dared to defy their enslavement. And so the writ of habeas corpus that we all hear about, even if we don't go to law school, it was denied. I mean, they just had no rights. So I just think that all these combination of clauses in the Constitution, statements in the Constitution, just put George Floyd and those who preceded him and those who have followed him, unfortunately, have just put their lives in danger. It denied them protections and empowered police to do what they wanted.
When put in this way, part of it also makes me wonder about, again, this other part of the story about how it relates to today and tomorrow, and the call for us to address issues of structural racism that's embedded in so much of our society. And Eduardo, could you speak a little bit to how film can help us examine some of the ways in which this racism, this otherness, this marginalization, how it can tell some of that story or show what has happened and what is currently happening in our society today?
It does it by inclusion of the stories. When you choose which stories to tell, I've dedicated the past 15 years just to tell and to report on African American stories in America. That is my personal choice, and the more the merrier. We should include them. I'd like to refer to what was Bettye just saying. I think that we have to start calling things for what they are. That is important. We have to call the murder of George Floyd what it was. It was a lynching. The problem is that once we refer to lynchings as something that is back in the future, and now we're in a different stage, and if you want to refer to lynching, you have to refer to the museum in Birmingham, Alabama, and it's not something that is happening today, then we risk perpetrating injustice. We all saw what happened that day. There were three men like Bettye well said, like those institutionalized patrols hired by the plantation owners to hunt runaways, who put their knee on an agonizing man and didn't stop until he was dead. We all saw it, and images are extremely powerful. Addressing your original question, what can we do as visual artists, as documentarians and photographers, is to get this out there to the people. Someone, I can't remember who, but someone was filming this on a phone. His role or her role was extremely important. And it changed it just a little bit, but it did change the way the things work today in America.
As you say that, I think about the images of Emmett Till and what came out from Emmett Till, and the images from George Floyd, because he was not the first Black man who was killed.
Oh no. And what is the fundamental difference between the killing of Emmett Till and the killing of George Floyd? Ultimately, it's the same. It's just now that work is legally performed by empowered men in uniform. Not all of them. We all know. I don't even have to say that, because otherwise it seems like, no, I'm not against the police. I'm not even in favor of defunding the police. I'm actually in favor of cleaning up their act and treating men as citizens, first-class citizens, across the board. That's what I think it's important, and that's what I think an image can do.
You know, Bettye, that we're both pediatricians, and as we're coming towards this end of our time, you know, I always think about our youth. And what is the story for our youth? What is the message that you want to share with our youth? What do you want them to take away from this?
Well, as you know, I was a pediatrician in Dorchester, one of Boston's inner city neighborhoods, for 31 years. And I really did love my job. But I was often dismayed when some of my Black patients would reveal to them that racism had gotten to them, that it had convinced them that they didn't have any talents, that they didn't have anything destined for them except jail or an early grave through violence. So, you know, this sense of hopelessness was just heartbreaking. And so I hope that our Black youth can, as I said before, embrace their slave ancestry and know for certain that those qualities that enabled enslaved people to get through, the horrendous experience of slavery can also help young people today get through the horrendous effects of racism on their lives. Because, our young people are quite talented. And they do have inner strengths, but to have to constantly being undervalued, having to live with the low expectations for them, that are seen in the schools and elsewhere. And, I'm just hoping that the message in the book will, make a small inroad into working against that. And excuse me, I do plan to write a young adult book so that young people can take a look at their enslaved ancestry for themselves and recognize for themselves, what they inherited.
Thank you. Eduardo, the same question for you.
I think that what I would like to add my will for an embracement of the period of slavery as exemplary and not to forget, but also to remind young audiences that mass incarceration today is another form of slavery, and that slavery by other means is still very much alive in America today.
I want to thank you both. I want to also remember a piece of what Bettye said in the film. It reminds me some of what you're talking about, Eduardo, and it's a piece about the bead. And as Bettye talked about imagining this woman in Africa with multiple red beads and being left with one, and thinking about where we are today, that our ancestors have left up gifts, be it the oral stories or these photographs or this strength that they've passed on. And I think of that bead as something that got carried forward, this connection to who we have been and who we are today and who we can be tomorrow. So I thank you. I thank you for sharing your family story. I'm so glad that you took those 30 years to write it and get it right. And Eduardo, I'm so glad that you reached out to Bettye and she said yes, because all of these versions, the written and the visual, the film, enrich all of our lives. Not just telling us about the path, but giving us a path of thinking about the future. For all who joined us today, thank you for joining us. And to both Dr. Kearse and Eduardo, thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
I said, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure and an honor